But one thing was for sure. His Excellence has won and lost after many years. The name that even after centuries, its echo still lingers in the mountains, plains, and cities of Europe. While some praise him as a hero, a genius, others associate his name with pain, destruction, and wars. But one thing is certain: Napoleon was no ordinary man. He was a man who changed the course of history, who made empires tremble, who sealed an era with victories and defeats. Today I will tell you how this little Corsican boy became an emperor who shook Europe. But my dear friends, every great story needs a beginning. It doesn't begin with high-ranking generals or enormous battlefields. No, it begins in Corsica, a small island surrounded by the warm breezes of the Mediterranean Sea. In 1769, on this island, which was still getting used to being a French territory, a child unaware that he holds the fate of an era in his hand. His story begins like the calm before the storm, but this silence will give birth to a storm that will destroy the fate of Europe. And now I will take you into that storm, into a world where passions, ambitions, and history dance. Are you ready? Because this is not only the story of an emperor, but also of what human will can achieve. Ah, my dear friends, today I am going to take you through the dusty pages of time to a small but stubborn island in the middle of the Mediterranean, Corsica. This island was a place where the wind whispered between olive trees, where the angry waves of the sea beat the shores, where poor but honorable people lived. The French had taken the island from the Genoese in 1768, but the Corsicans were a rebellious people who did not accept easily. For them, French rule was nothing less than an occupation, and this situation caused deep wounds in the hearts of the islanders. It was during this difficult period, on August 15th, 1769, in Ajaccio, that Napoleon Bonaparte, as his family called him then, was born. Napoleon's family came from a noble background, but this nobility did not make them rich. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, was a lawyer and resistance fighter, while his mother, Letizia Remolino, was a woman renowned for her strong will and strict discipline. Letizia's resilience would leave a deep mark on Napoleon's life, as her son would cling to life by resisting and fighting, just as his mother had taught him. Napoleon was the second child of the family, and from an early age it was evident that he had a fire in him. His Corsican blood gave him a stubborn spirit, but fate would take him far beyond the borders of Corsica. Imagine a little boy, a boy with a wounded pride, playing with his brothers in the narrow streets of Corsica, witnessing his family being despised by the French. In those days, a seed sprouted in Napoleon's heart to free himself and his family from this humiliation. It was a turning point in the young boy's life when his father Carlo submitted to French rule and tried to introduce Napoleon to French culture. Carlo wanted to guarantee his family's future by staying close to the French, so he sent his son to French schools. So Napoleon had to leave his family at the age of 9 and go to France, to the military school in Brienne. Imagine, my dear friends, a child alone in a land where no one speaks the language, in a land where no one knows him. Little Napoleon was subjected to the ridicule of his classmates as he struggled to learn broken French. His heavy Corsican accent made him an outcast. But Napoleon did not succumb to these scorns. On the contrary, they fueled his inner fire. He knew that he had to prove himself in this world and focused on his studies with all his might. His days at military school. It was here that Napoleon's genius began to shine for the first time. His superior ability in mathematics and strategic thinking attracted the attention of his teachers. His interest in the art of war led him to devote every spare moment to books. He read about Caesar's campaigns and Alexander the Great's victories and dreamed of following in their footsteps. Imagine what he said to his friends in those days. "One day the whole world will hear my name." Those who knew him laughed, but Napoleon had faith in his eyes. Perhaps even in those days, fate was whispering about his great passion. Sometimes it is better to be alone, and life works to be better. And so, my dear friends, after his studies at Brienne, Napoleon was admitted to the École Militaire in Paris. He was now on his way to becoming a real soldier. When he graduated at 16 as an artillery officer, everyone talked about his diligence. But this young man was not only good at his studies, he was an observer of people, analyzing their weaknesses and strengths. Like a chess player, these skills would enable him to make moves that would change the fate of Europe in the future. But now he was a young man, full of ambition, full of hurt pride, but never giving up. And how could this little Corsican become an emperor who conquered the hearts of Europe? What was the first step that brought him to the stage of history? Ah, my friends, we will look for the answers to these questions in the next story, because Napoleon's first great test in his life lies in the steps he will take in the shadow of the revolution. My dear friends, I will now take you back to one of the most turbulent times in history, to the roaring streets of an age of revolution, to the cries for freedom echoing in the shadow of the guillotines, and to the pangs of a nation's rebirth. The year was 1789. France was racked by heavy taxes, hunger and inequality. On the one hand, there were aristocrats who debauched in sumptuous palaces, and on the other, the poor who could not find dry bread. Anger and despair had finally ignited a barrel full of gunpowder. When the stones of the Bastille prison fell, it was not just the collapse of a building, but the end of an order. The people rose up, freedom, equality, fraternity. But revolutions, my friends, are chaotic and bloody. As the old order collapses, it is not clear what will take its place. France was thrown into chaos. The king was deposed and the streets were at the mercy of the rebels and the revolutionary courts. It was at such a time that a young soldier stepped onto the scene. Remember, this was a boy from the stony streets of Corsica, despised in French schools, raised on ambition and determination. He was Napoleon Bonaparte. He began his military career in the lower ranks, waiting for the opportunities that the chaos of the revolution would offer him. For this was a time when anyone with courage and talent could rewrite their destiny with their own hands. But nonetheless, he went on, getting a graduate degree and working in the shackles of tradition were broken, and ranks were earned through achievement, not inheritance. Napoleon was waiting for the opportunity of a lifetime, and it came in Toulon. It was 1793, and Toulon, an important port city in the south of France, had been captured by the Royalists and the British Navy. The port was of vital importance to France. Losing it would mean a complete loss of control over the Mediterranean. The revolutionary government launched a military operation to retake Toulon, but things were not going well. The army was inexperienced and disorganized, and the commanders didn't know what to do. It was in the midst of this turmoil that Napoleon Bonaparte, a young artillery officer, attracted attention. As Napoleon watched the siege of Toulon, he made plans with his eyes roaming over the maps. For him, victory would come with a sudden and effective blow, like a dagger to the heart of the enemy. He had identified the weak points of the British and pro-royalist forces defending Toulon. His eyes sparkling and his voice resolute, he stood before the commanders and explained his strategy. Napoleon's plan was to deploy artillery at the most critical points in the city, forcing the British fleet out of the harbor and leaving the city undefended. At first, the commanders hesitated in the face of this young man's courage and intelligence, but desperation forced them to trust Napoleon. And my friends, when the cannons at Napoleon's command fired, the sky over Toulon was filled with gunpowder smoke. French cannons were shattering the enemy's defenses, forcing British ships to flee the harbor. Napoleon was at the heart of the attack, inspiring his troops and keeping their morale high with his composure. Finally, after days of bloody fighting, Toulon fell. As the French flag flew again on the city walls, the revolutionary government realized that it had gained a young hero. The victory at Toulon had made Napoleon's name known throughout France. Now everyone was talking about this young artillery officer, about his genius and courage. A few months earlier, he had been an ordinary officer, but now he had attracted the attention of the revolutionary government and had been promoted in rank. But Napoleon was not one to be satisfied with this victory. Toulon was only the beginning for him. Mathieu Telemetry, he knew that he was destined for greater victories and was eagerly awaiting new opportunities. But my friends, France was still not at peace. The chaos of the revolution had plunged the country into civil wars and external threats. So how would Napoleon navigate through this turmoil, and what events would lead him to the brink of becoming the most powerful man in France? We will find the answers to these questions in our next story. Ah, my dear friends, I will now tell you about the first great moment when a young man, Napoleon Bonaparte, began to change the course of history. This young officer, only in his late 20s, thinly built but with a fire in his eyes, was to take his destiny and the future of France on a completely different path. Revolutionary France was still in chaos, poverty, enmities, the vengeful gaze of kings and emperors united to destroy the new republic. Enemies surrounded France like a circle, waiting for an opportunity to break the weakest link. Meanwhile, the army, the hope of the republic, was scattered in the mountains and plains of Italy, exhausted and demoralized. It was 1796. The French government had appointed the young and promising Napoleon to lead the army in Italy. But my friends, this army could hardly be called an army. The soldiers, hungry and miserable, in their torn uniforms, out of ammunition, tired from fighting, these men felt forgotten. Their generals had abandoned them. There was no hope of victory on the battlefield. The day Napoleon arrived, there was no hope in the eyes of these soldiers, only doubt. Was this young man, this puny officer, going to lead them to victory? But Napoleon started on the field, not with his sword or his rifle, but with his words. He stood in front of his soldiers and began to speak in his distinctive, sharp voice. My comrades, you are half naked, you are hungry, but the government owes you. It has nothing to give you, but I will take you to rich lands, where glory and victory await you. At that moment, the soldiers' gaze changed. There was magic in this man's words. For these soldiers, marching in hunger and poverty, victory and riches were not a dream. but a reality in Napoleon's promise. This young commander was not only a military genius, he was an orator. He knew how to instill hope in his soldiers, and that army, my friends, filled with hope, marched on Italy under Napoleon's command. Napoleon practiced the art of war like a painter on canvas. His plans were far beyond conventional methods. He moved the army quickly, attacked from unexpected points, divided his forces, and then focused on a single point to establish overwhelming superiority. Napoleon's tactics stunned his opponents. The Austrian armies defending Italy and their allies had not yet realized how dangerous this young commander was. But Napoleon was advancing step by step, valley by valley, city by city. His first great victory came at Montagnat. Here Napoleon defeated the Austrians and gave his army a taste of victory. Then he wrote another epic at the Lodi Bridge. On that bridge, Napoleon himself fought on the front line with his soldiers. The rifles were exploding, the cannons were thundering, but he was standing tall, giving courage to his soldiers. The victory at Lodi showed everyone that Napoleon was not only a commander, but also a courageous leader. That day, Napoleon became a hero in the eyes of his soldiers. The soldiers now called him Little Corporal, but the nickname was one of love and respect. Napoleon's victories in Italy came one after another. Millesimo, Castiglione, Arcole. With each victory, France's morale rose and the fear of its enemies grew. Napoleon's name was now the talk of Europe. Even the people of Italy were in awe of this young commander. Cities were surrendering one by one, and French flags were waving in the sky as Napoleon's army advanced. But there was something else about Napoleon, my friends. War was not only won with the sword, he also knew how to win the hearts of the people. When he entered the cities, he said that he would protect the people's property, that he would bring freedom, and he got the support of the people. That is why he was welcomed not only as a commander, but as a savior. At the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon had won a great victory for France. No one could ignore him anymore. He had started his journey as just an artillery officer, but he shone like a star in the eyes of the French people. In the streets of Paris, children sang his name, and soldiers wanted to be like him. But my friends, for Napoleon, this was only the beginning. This young man had tasted power and victory, and now Napoleon's eyes shone with far greater dreams. The kings and emperors sitting on the thrones of Europe recognized the rise of this young genius. But what would Napoleon do next? In which lands would he win new victories, and who would he bring to their knees? Well, my friends, we will find out the answer to these questions in our next story. And my dear friends, I will now take you to a distant land, to the land of Egypt, where the sun shines like gold and sandstorms blow like soul-shaking screams. This is perhaps the most interesting, the most mystical part of the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, from a young general to a legend. Napoleon, who had brought Europe to its knees with victories, now had his eyes set on greater horizons. And why Egypt? What was he doing in this distant land of hot, parched deserts and ancient secrets? By 1798, the enmity between France and Britain had turned into a blood feud. England, with its trade routes and colonies, seemed to dominate the world stage. Napoleon wanted to break the back of this powerful rival. Instead of directly attacking the heart of England, it was necessary to cut the arteries leading to it. That is why he turned his eyes to Egypt. This was both a strategic move and a shining dream in Napoleon's mind. With the capture of Egypt, the British trade route to India would be cut, and France would open the door to the rich lands of the East. But this was not just a military campaign, my friends. Napoleon had another desire in his heart: science and civilization. Yes, Napoleon took not only his soldiers with him on this campaign, but also France's most brilliant scientists, engineers, and artists. When he said conquer the East, he meant not only with swords, but with the pen, with knowledge and discoveries. Napoleon wanted to go down in history as a genius by unlocking the ancient secrets of Egypt. He would win victories and leave a scientific legacy at the same time. He was a dreamer as much as he was a commander, my friends. And it was in pursuit of this dream that the sails were inflated and the French fleet began to move through the waters of the Mediterranean. When the French reached the shores of Egypt, history would be rewritten in a land where time seemed to stand still. Napoleon and his army landed in Alexandria on July 4th, 1798. As they marched across the sands, ancient pyramids, sphinxes, and giant stone monuments began to appear before the French soldiers. At that moment, Napoleon turned to his soldiers and said his famous words: "Soldiers, you are in the shadow of these gigantic monuments that have watched over us for thousands of years." Those words lifted the spirits of tired and confused soldiers, for Napoleon was a leader who knew how to triumph in hearts as well as on the battlefield. But victory in Egypt would not be easy. The Mamluks ruled in this land controlled by the Ottoman Empire. They were renowned for their warriors on horseback and their sharp swords. But Napoleon, no matter who he was up against, knew how to outsmart his enemies. The French army soon clashed with the Mamluks. One of the most famous battles was the Battle of the Pyramids. Imagine, my friends, French soldiers marching in tight ranks under the sun, facing the fearless horsemen of the Mamluks. The sand was blowing and the swords were flashing. But Napoleon tore the Mamluk army apart with a tactic we call the square formation. When the French artillery stopped the Mamluk horsemen, the wind of victory was blowing in Napoleon's face. That day, Napoleon once again proved his genius to the world. That night, but these victories were not without shadow. The French fleet was destroyed in the Gulf of Abu Qir by the fleet of the British Admiral Horatio Nelson. That night, my dear friends, the Mediterranean lit up in flames and the French ships sank one by one. Although Napoleon had won victories in Egypt, he was cut off from France. He and his army were now alone in the land of Egypt. But Napoleon was not one to accept defeat. In addition to his military successes, thanks to the work of scientists, another side of this campaign emerged: discoveries and the triumph of science. French scientists began to study the ancient ruins of Egypt. Temples, tombs, giant stone pillars, all of them were examined one by one. And, my friends, the greatest discovery of this expedition was the Rosetta Stone. This stone was the key to deciphering ancient Egyptian writing. There were 3 different scripts on it: hieroglyphics, Demotic script, and Greek. This stone was the door that opened the secrets of ancient Egypt to humanity. Napoleon's campaign may not have been a complete military victory, but it was a revolution for the world of science. When Napoleon left Egypt, he left behind an unfinished campaign, shattered dreams, but a legacy that would live forever. On his return to France, this experience transformed him into something more than a commander, into a leader. But my friends, things in France were badly in turmoil. So what was Napoleon going to do when he got back into that turmoil? How would he pave the road to power? You will find the answer to this question in my next story. My friends, the story I am about to tell is one of those moments that changed the history of France forever. When a leader, not a young general, stepped onto the world stage. 18 Brumaire. It is not a date, but a turning point. France, torn by revolutions, crises, and turmoil, was waiting for a saving hand. That hand was the hand of Napoleon Bonaparte. With his sharp mind, endless ambition, and iron will, by 1799, France was once again in chaos. The revolution had overthrown the monarchy, but had failed to replace it with a stable order. The Directory government had lost the confidence of the people, had become corrupt and weak. On the one hand, the people were struggling with hunger and misery. On the other hand, politicians who abused the ideals of the revolution. The country was tossing from side to side as if the rudder of a giant ship had broken. It was at such a time that Napoleon returned from the Egyptian campaign. In France, his name had already become a legend. The people welcomed him as a hero and saw a saving light in his eyes. He was the brightest and most talented of the generals. But Napoleon was not a man who was content to be just a commander. His eye was much higher. Two brave politicians, among them names like Sieyès, rallied around Napoleon. They saw that the Directory government was in decline and they needed a strong leader to save the country. Napoleon's intelligence, charisma, and influence with the people meant that he was the only one who could do the job. The plan was simple: overthrow the Directory and replace it with a new government. But this required a swift, decisive, and surprising move. It was on November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire, according to the French calendar, that the great coup took place. That morning, the air in Paris was filled with the calm before the storm. Napoleon marched with his troops toward the palace of Saint Cloud, where the assembly was meeting. Before the members of the Directory knew what was happening, Napoleon's troops had already surrounded the palace. Inside there was great confusion. Deputies were shouting and the chaos was growing. Napoleon appeared before the assembly with calm but determined steps. "France is in chaos. We need a strong government to save our country," he cried. But some deputies objected, accusing Napoleon of being a dictator. At that moment, the stern look on Napoleon's face changed everything. It was not the face of a commander, but of a leader. Soldiers entered the hall and the Directory was disbanded on Napoleon's orders. The remnants of the French Revolution were erased that day and the foundations of a new order were laid. And the next day, Napoleon declared himself first consul. A new constitution was drafted which gave Napoleon almost unlimited powers. The people welcomed this new era with hope. Tired of the revolution, people were looking for peace in the hands of a strong leader. Napoleon's consulship had begun, and my friends, there were countless reforms that healed France's wounds and made it strong again. But for Napoleon, this was only the beginning. He dreamed that one day he would sit on a bigger throne. And so, my dear friends, as this new order of France brought Napoleon to the top, he was moving step by step toward the power he had dreamed of. Consulship was not enough. Napoleon wanted to be an emperor who held the fate of France in his hands. By 1804, France was no longer a republic but an empire. Under Napoleon's leadership, the people were emerging victorious from wars and order was being restored in the economy and social life. His name was now whispered with fear, not only in France but throughout Europe. While the monarchies turned against Napoleon, fearing that he might rekindle the flames of revolution, the people in France saw him as a hero, a leader, and the great day arrived. In Paris, Notre Dame Cathedral was decorated with golden lights and prepared for a ceremony fit for a king. Napoleon had even invited Pope Pius VII to the ceremony. But, my friends, the most striking moment of this ceremony was when Napoleon placed the imperial crown on his head with his own hands. Traditionally, the Pope would place the crown on the monarch's head, but Napoleon did not bow, no. He wanted to show that he derived his power not from God, but from his will and his people. At that very moment, with all eyes on him, Napoleon took the crown in his hands and placed it on his head. It was a show of power. Napoleon was no longer just the leader of France, but an emperor to be engraved in the pages of history. But the spectacle infuriated the monarchies of Europe. It was a disaster in the eyes of the kings if France produced an emperor. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia began to forge new alliances against Napoleon. Europe was preparing to challenge Napoleon, but Napoleon's eyes were on the map of Europe, a map that would be redrawn by the epics he would write on the battlefield. But my friends, would Napoleon's rise end there? What storm would the echo of his steps create in Europe? As he won victories on the battlefields, what defeats would he face? You will find the answers to these questions in my next story. My friends, I will now tell you about another aspect of Napoleon Bonaparte that was as impressive as his victories on the battlefields. His reforms. Yes, Napoleon was not only a man of swords, cannons, and conquests. He was a leader with a pen sharper than a sword, who knew how to rebuild a country. His reforms in France would influence the fate not only of that period, but of the whole world for centuries to come. After the chaos of the Revolution, order had to be established in France. People were still searching for equality, freedom, and justice, but the revolution had left no system to realize these ideals. The country was stuck between the old traditions and the ruins of the revolution. It was at this point that Napoleon came on the scene and decided to establish a permanent order. One of his greatest works was undoubtedly the Code Napoleon, better known as the Code Civil. Imagine that at that time, different rules of law were applied in every corner of France. The revolution had abolished the old system, but it failed to replace it with a uniform legal system. Napoleon wanted justice to be equal for everyone. He established a system where everyone, rich or poor, peasant or noble, would be judged by the same laws. The Code Civil protected private property, guaranteed the rights of individuals, and put the rule of law above all else. These laws became a model not only for France, but for all of Europe. Even today, you can see traces of Napoleon in the legal systems of many countries. But Napoleon did not stop at law. Education, economy, administrative system, all were reshaped by his touch. Take education, for example. Napoleon believed that education was the future of a nation. He had schools established and restructured the education system. He guaranteed the future of France by training students, especially in engineering, science, and mathematics. For him, strong brains were as important as a strong army. The victory of soldiers was won with a sword, but the victory of a nation was crowned with education. In the economy, Napoleon ended the disorder brought about by the revolution. To strengthen the French economy, he supported agriculture, revitalized trade, and put the state's finances on a solid foundation. He had new banks established. The Bank of France was born during his reign. By fixing the value of money, he gained people's trust. These economic moves of Napoleon began to ease the burden of poverty on the people. Under his leadership, the French felt they could breathe again. And administrative reforms. Napoleon reorganized France from one end to the other. He wiped out the remnants of the old feudal system and replaced it with a centralized administration. The hand of the state now reached even to the remotest corners. The governors were directly subordinate to Napoleon and conveyed the needs of the people to the center. Thanks to this system, France became both a strong government and a state that remained in touch with the people. But, my dear friends, Napoleon's reforms were a legacy not only for those who lived at the time, but also for generations to come. It was during his reign that the foundations of the modern state were laid. His laws, his innovations in education, his economic regulations, all of these tell us about his vision even today. Napoleon may be known for his victories on the battlefield, but his real triumph was the reforms that brought France back to its feet. But my friends, could Napoleon's achievements last forever? Would he, like every star that rises on the stage of history, one day have to go out? Would the power that carried him to victory one day lead him to disaster? We will look for the answers to these questions in my next story. Wait, because Napoleon's fate will take us into many more adventures. My friends, now I will tell you about those years when Napoleon shone like a thunderbolt and shook the whole of Europe. Imagine such a storm that brought the long-established kings and dynasties of Europe to their knees, while at the same time changing the fate of millions. This was the Napoleonic Wars. And among these wars, there was one shining victory, and its name was Austerlitz. Let's go back to those glorious days together. By 1805, Napoleon was recognized as a leader who had dominated much of Europe and carried the ideals of the French Revolution by the sword. But this was unacceptable to the established monarchies in Europe. Britain, Russia, Austria, and several other countries came together to overthrow Napoleon. This is how the War of the Third Coalition began. They wanted to stop Napoleon's rise, to blow the winds of revolution out of Europe. But didn't they know that once the storm blew, it was the hardest to stop? Napoleon's goal was clear: to defeat his enemies one by one and break up the coalition. He was a genius on the battlefield. The superior numbers of his enemies were only a detail for him. When he set out from France with his army, every soldier had faith in his eyes. Napoleon's soldiers neither feared death nor complained of fatigue as they followed him. For them, Napoleon was more than a leader. He was the epitome of victory. And here is Austerlitz. On December 1st, 1805, Napoleon would achieve one of the greatest victories in history. The Austrian and Russian armies faced the French with 900 soldiers. Napoleon's army barely reached 70,000, but war is not won by numbers alone. Intelligence and strategy come first. Napoleon used his enemies' pride to lure them into his trap, to appear weak, to make them attack him. This was Napoleon's greatest game. The morning mist had descended on the plains of Austerlitz. As the French army advanced into the heart of their enemies, the sun's rays suddenly pierced through the mists. This moment would go down in history as the Austerlitz sun. For the French soldiers, it was a sign, a harbinger of victory. Napoleon executed his strategy skillfully. The enemy attacked, thinking that the French center was weak, but this was exactly what Napoleon wanted. The flanks of the French army quickly enveloped the enemy troops. The Russian and Austrian troops were crushed before they knew what hit them. By the end of the battle, the French had eliminated 3,6,000 enemy soldiers. Standing on the battlefield, Napoleon turned to his soldiers and said these words that made them feel the magnitude of the victory. "My soldiers, this victory will go down in history in golden letters." Austerlitz was not just a battle. This victory was a testament to Napoleon's genius. The powerful monarchies of Europe were helpless before the genius of the French leader. With this victory, Napoleon not only crushed the Third Coalition, but also engraved French power in the heart of Europe. In the eyes of the people, these victories transformed Napoleon into a hero, a legend. As victory marches echoed through the streets of France, anxious whispers rose in the palaces of Europe. No one could predict what Napoleon would do next. But my friends, with this victory, the fate of Europe was reshaped. The storm of Austerlitz may be over, but Napoleon would not stop. He was a leader who vowed to run from victory to victory. But my friends, can such great victories come without a price? As Napoleon's rise continued, what were the dangers that grew in the shadow of these victories? In my next story, I will tell you how Napoleon's shadow over Europe turned into an empire. Oh, my friends, you don't want to miss that story. Ah, my dear friends, Napoleon's star had shone at Austerlitz, his victories echoing in the heart of Europe. But this man was not only a commander, he was also a chess master, that strategic genius who moved the board back and forth, who moved kings and tsars like pawns. By 1807, a new game had been set up on this chessboard. Napoleon's eyes were now turned eastward. The ancient rivalry between Tsarist Russia and France had to end. And what ended this rivalry, my friends, was a treaty that changed history. Treaty of Tilsit. Now sit back and close your eyes, because I am going to take you back to that hot summer day, July 7th, 1807, the town of Tilsit in Germany. Imagine a floating raft in the middle of a river. This raft would bring Napoleon and Russian Tsar Alexander I together. It was as if the world had stopped, and even the calm waters of the river held their breath. On the one hand, the invincible Napoleon, on the other, the great Russian emperor. Two leaders, both trying to outdo each other, but both secretly seeking a compromise. Whereas a few years earlier, Napoleon had never even set his eyes on the icy plains of Russia, now he had to shake Alexander's hand. This was the power of diplomacy, born out of the destruction left behind by wars.
Why do you think this treaty was needed?
But this required peace in the east. In Tilsit, the two leaders talked for days. On that floating raft on the river, not only borders were drawn, worlds were recreated. Napoleon and Alexander redrew the map of Europe together. Prussia's territory was reduced. Puppet states were created under French patronage. The Duchy of Warsaw was established on Polish territory at Napoleon's request. This duchy was like an outpost of Napoleon against Russia. Alexander managed to bind the Baltic states and Finland to himself. Russia agreed to join Napoleon's economic embargo against Britain. Europe was now becoming a continent shaped by Napoleon's hand. My dear friends, do you know what was most interesting about Tilsit? The strange friendship between Napoleon and Alexander. They were both fascinated by each other. Napoleon said he had great respect for Alexander, and Alexander called Napoleon the hero of the age. But this friendship was false. Those handshakes on the floating raft were nothing more than masks worn by the two leaders to deceive each other. Napoleon knew that Russia would not be a loyal ally. Alexander saw this peace as an opportunity for Russia to regain its strength. Both felt in their hearts that when the time came, they would stand up to each other. For Napoleon, Tilsit was a climax. The French Empire was now at its most powerful. Much of Europe was under its control. One by one, the old monarchies had fallen, and revolutionary winds had spread across the continent. But, my friends, every leader who goes to the top has to come down one day, doesn't he? The order that took shape in Tilsit was in fact a reflection of Napoleon's victories. But the cracks underlying this order would soon be exposed. And then what happened? Napoleon thought he had brought Europe to its knees, but this peace would not last long. The footsteps of the great collapse that would change Napoleon's fate could already be heard in the distance. But which mistake would be Napoleon's undoing? I will tell that story next time, my friends. Ah, what a storm those days were. In the next episode, we'll be heading to Napoleon's greatest campaign, the icy Russian steppes. Get ready. Ah, friends, Napoleon's star once shone like the sun on the smoky plains of Austerlitz. This great emperor terrorized the four corners of Europe, leading his armies triumphantly from victory to victory. But in the pages of history, every great leader faces a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, doesn't he? For Napoleon, this obstacle began in Spain, a land surrounded by provincial towns and steep mountains in the southwest of Europe. The year 1808 was a time when Napoleon was burning with dreams of shaping Europe. Portugal's resistance to Napoleon's continental blockade of Britain had prompted the French army to advance towards the small country. But the road to Portugal passed through Spain. Napoleon, taking advantage of the weakness of King Carlos IV of Spain and the political turmoil in the country, wanted to bring these territories under his control. So much so that, while ostensibly acting as an ally, in reality it was increasingly intervening in Spain's internal affairs. One day, an uneasy wind blew through the streets of Madrid. Napoleon deposed the king and put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Spain. The people of Spain, he said, must benefit from the light of freedom of the French Revolution. But friends, freedom was not what Napoleon described. The Spaniards saw Napoleon's soldiers not as liberators, but as a force of occupation. And here, on the stage of history, a revolt broke out. Fighting with swords, axes, and even rakes, the peasants planted a seed of resistance in the mountains, forests, and towns of Spain. This new war was unorthodox. Napoleon's great armies were known for their superiority in organized warfare. But in Spain, it was futile to expect his enemies to rally and fight on one front. Guerrilla warfare, the irregular struggle waged by the people en masse, exhausted the French soldiers. Soldiers who were attacked in a village while eating a hot meal would find the same attackers disappearing among the civilian population the next day. Spanish guerrillas set up ambushes in mountain passes, cutting French troops into small pieces and destroying them. This style of warfare rendered even Napoleon's trained generals helpless. And then there was England. Ah, England. Napoleon's greatest enemy managed to foment war without even landing troops in continental Europe. They were showering Spanish guerrillas with arms, ammunition, and training. The British general Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, entered Spain via Portugal and began to weaken Napoleon's forces. The French had to deal not only with guerrillas, but also with a professional British army. Yet Napoleon did not give up. He himself went to Spain to rally the regular army and won great victories. He recaptured Madrid and took drastic measures to crush the resistance of the guerrillas. But friends, These victories of Napoleon's were really no more than wallowing in quicksand. The more victories the French army won, the more enemies it won. Every territory it won became a new center of resistance. Popular hatred grew, and morale among French soldiers began to collapse. Spain had become a deadly game board for Napoleon. But could Napoleon overcome this chaotic situation? Would the French army make it out of the exhausting quagmire of Spain? In our next story, we will see how history took a sharp turn with one of Napoleon's greatest defeats, the Russian campaign. Dear friends, when we tell the story of Napoleon, we see how victories and ambition can elevate a leader. But do not forget that he was history's wisest teacher, and he did not forgive arrogance or rashness. Here is the turning point that would shake Napoleon's meteoric rise, the Russian campaign. On a spring morning, the Empire's magnificent army marched towards Moscow. But this journey would turn into one of history's greatest tragedies. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon's anger was unrelenting. Tsar Alexander I of Russia had defied Napoleon's continental blockade and dared to resume trade with Britain. Napoleon could not accept this defiance. "I must teach Russia a lesson," he said, and assembled the Grand Armée, 000 men from all over Europe. This army represented Napoleon's greatest power. But friends, it is not just numbers that make an army great. Every soldier would carry the weight of this long and brutal campaign on his back. At first, everything seemed to go according to Napoleon's plan. The French army crossed the Polish lands and advanced into Russia. However, the Russians adopted an unorthodox method of defense. Instead of confronting them in a major pitched battle, they abandoned their territory and retreated. They left Napoleon's army with no supplies or shelter. Fields were set on fire, villages emptied, and even wells poisoned. This method would go down in history as the tactic of total attrition. French soldiers were drifting across the steppes of Russia, without a destination, without even a piece of wood to burn. Finally, the moment we've been waiting for, Borodino. The Battle of Borodino. History has rarely witnessed such a bloody and fierce battle. Napoleon confronted the Russian army near this town. To open the road to Moscow, on the morning of the battle, the clatter of swords and the thunder of cannons could be heard in the mist. Even my bravest soldier will not be brought to his knees on this land. Napoleon said as he marched his troops forward. In Borodino, 700 people were killed or wounded. Yes, Napoleon won. But friends, the cost of this victory was unimaginably heavy. His army was weakened and demoralized. And here is Moscow. When Napoleon entered Moscow after Borodino, he expected to be greeted with victory bells. But he was greeted in the city neither by the Tsar nor by a letter of surrender. Moscow was empty. Tsar Alexander had evacuated the city's inhabitants, leaving only ruins. What's more, Moscow was on fire. By burning their own capital, the Russians had left Napoleon with no resources to use. Napoleon sat in the Kremlin palace, watching the flames rising into the sky from his window. "Is this a trap set for me by fate?" he is said to have thought. Napoleon's victory did not resonate in a city reduced to ashes. But the real disaster began on the way back. Winter. The Russian winter, dear friends, the most ruthless enemy an army can face. Napoleon's troops were torn apart by hunger, cold, and endless guerrilla attacks. Many of the soldiers in their jackets froze to death. Others eat the flesh of their horses to avoid starvation. History even whispers that some soldiers resorted to darker means to survive. Napoleon was losing more and more of his troops every day, marching desperately through muddy and icy roads. When that great army of 600,000 returned to France, only 200,000 remained. The first corps of manhead Zeppelins dispersed after the war. But would Napoleon be able to cope with this defeat? Or was this disaster the beginning of the end for Europe's greatest emperor? In the next chapter, the great battle that would decide Napoleon's fate, the Battle of Leipzig. How do you think fate weaves its threads? It often seems as though our future revolves around fear. Ah, my young friends. Here we come to one of the exemplary pages of history. Napoleon's story, full of successes that shone like a star in the sky, is now shadowed by dark clouds. After the great disaster of the Russian campaign, the powerful states of Europe were once again united. Faced with the unique threat posed to them by Napoleon, they were ready to put aside old enmities and challenge the emperor. This was the moment the Sixth Coalition was born. The kings and leaders of Europe sensed that Napoleon was weakening. And when a hunter smells a wounded lion, he takes ruthless action. Napoleon quickly tried to replenish the troops he had lost in Russia. Little did he know that these small French peasants, country boys, and even inexperienced soldiers would face the most experienced armies in Europe. But Napoleon's determination alone could neither restore his country's depleted resources nor rebuild an exhausted empire. France was exhausted by the endless wars. The people were growing cold towards Napoleon, whom they had once seen as a hero. An internal strife was slowly surfacing. In this confusion, Napoleon found himself back on the battlefield. The Sixth Coalition was made up of Prussia, Russia, Austria, Britain, and Sweden. They all wanted to end Napoleon's absolute domination of Europe. The coalition forces took the field with all the tactics they had learned since the early days of Napoleon's revolutionary wars. Napoleon was still confident in his wits. He thought he could outsmart this coalition as well as any other. But Leipzig? Ah, my friends of Leipzig, that moment when history turned against Napoleon. The Battle of Leipzig is known as the War of Nations, and it's not hard to understand why. The battlefield was home to one of the largest armies history had ever seen. In October 1813, the surroundings of Leipzig were transformed into a massive battlefield with around 600,000 troops deployed. On one side, Napoleon's 200,000 string army. On the other, the coalition's 400,000 string force of Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish soldiers. As the roar of cannons and the clatter of steel swords echoed across the battlefield, one of the bloodiest battles in history had begun. Napoleon tried to win the war with his usual brilliant strategy. He controlled the villages around Leipzig, river crossings, and important roads. But this time the enemy was just as cunning and determined. Throughout the days of fighting, the French army bled. The soldiers were drained of morale and strength. Napoleon, once the symbol of victory, was now in the shadow of defeat. The coalition army surrounded Napoleon's troops, gradually squeezing them into the narrow streets of Leipzig. My friends, the cruelest moment for Napoleon in Leipzig was when he witnessed the fate of his own soldiers. A bridge, yes, a bridge sealed the fate of the battle. As the French army tried to retreat, the bridge that would have enabled the retreat was blown up prematurely. Thousands of French soldiers were trapped by the enemy with no way to escape. As the muddy streets of Leipzig were littered with corpses, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. This war had shattered not only Napoleon's army, but also his imperial ideals. The defeat at Leipzig showed that Napoleon was no longer invincible. Europe realized that the great emperor would finally be brought to his knees. The territory of France was now defenseless and open to enemy forces. But Napoleon was not one to surrender easily. On the way back to Paris from Leipzig, he still had a plan, still had hope. But what would Napoleon do after this heavy defeat? How far would he go to defend his empire against the united powers of Europe? In the next episode, let's witness the first steps of Napoleon's journey into exile. This first scene in the play exemplifies the power of Napoleon's journey into exile. Ah, my children, imagine that the man who was once the sole ruler of Europe is now exiled to a small island like Elba. While fate had carried Napoleon to the heights, it had also driven him into the darkest abysses. The defeat at the Battle of Leipzig and the subsequent march of the Sixth Coalition on Paris seemed to spell the end for Napoleon. In 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate his throne when the Allied forces arrived at the gates of France. Europe's leaders decided to exile him on the Isle of Elba so that the great man would never again pose a danger. Here, under the warm winds of the Mediterranean, Napoleon's days of exile began. The island of Elba, a small, tranquil island surrounded by azure seas as far as the eye can see. But for a great emperor, this island was like a cage. As soon as Napoleon arrived on the island, he realized that nothing of the splendor of the old days remained. A few loyal soldiers, a small mansion, and the locals had replaced the splendid palaces, loyal generals, and enthusiastic people of Paris. But those who knew Napoleon know that he was never one to be cowed by a simple defeat. His time on the island once again demonstrated Napoleon's intelligence and determination. Elba was an almost forgotten island at the time, but even here Napoleon tried to restore order. He organized a small army, started agricultural projects, and took care of the local population. Although from the outside it looked like the simple life of an emperor spending his days in exile, Napoleon's mind was always on France. He was sending agents to find out what was happening in Paris and keeping a close eye on the political balance in Europe. There was still hope in his heart that he could reclaim his throne. Meanwhile, things were not going well in France. Louis XV, who succeeded Napoleon on the throne, had failed to win the love of the people. The monarchy was far from meeting the expectations of the people and the spirit of revolution that Napoleon had brought. In many parts of France, people still saw Napoleon as a savior. This showed that despite his exile, Napoleon's influence was still strong, and at that moment Napoleon decided to act. In February 1815, Napoleon escaped from the island of Elba in a small ship. He had only a few hundred soldiers with him, but he carried great faith in his heart. He was sure that when he arrived on the shores of France, the people and his former soldiers would run to him loyally. And indeed they did. When Napoleon landed in southern France, the people greeted their former emperor with enthusiasm. The eagle has crossed the Alps, the news quickly spread throughout France. As he marched towards Paris, Napoleon gathered more and more supporters. The soldiers and the people wanted to see him as a leader once again. By the time he reached Paris, Louis XIV had already fled. Napoleon was restored to his throne almost without resistance. Those halcyon days ushered in a short but dramatic period that would become known as the 100 Days. Napoleon once again challenged Europe. He summoned his old generals, reorganized the army, and tried to regain his lost reputation. This time, however, his enemies were stronger and more determined. Part 3. Napoleon and the Byzantiums. The great powers of Europe vowed not to allow Napoleon to return, but can Napoleon's daring comeback return him to the days of his glory? Or will the united forces of Europe be able to stop him for good this time? My young friends, let us meet in the next chapter, on the bloody battlefield of Waterloo, for the most dramatic part of our story. Béjampois Saint-Théorème, Saint Helena. Ah, my friends, isn't life a strange cycle? An emperor who had once shouted in triumph so many times before was now taking perhaps his last gamble. I'm talking, of course, about Napoleon Bonaparte. In June 1815, the fate of Europe was once again in his hands. But this time things were different. No longer were his armies at their former strength, nor were the thrones of Europe unprepared for Napoleon's genius. The united forces of Europe were more determined than ever to make him history for good. And so, the last page of fate would be written in the quiet and austere Belgian village of Waterloo. After his return from exile in Elba, Napoleon began a short but fiery period of rule that lasted 100 days. But the great powers of Europe did not accept his return. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia put aside their old enmities and united against Napoleon. These coalition forces were determined to stop him once and for all. Napoleon sat down at the gambling table for the last time, gathering his army in the hope of redrawing the map of Europe. In mid-June, Napoleon put his grand plan into action. He planned to move quickly and defeat his enemies one by one. He aimed to defeat the British army under Wellington and the Prussian army under Blücher on two separate fronts. Napoleon's strategy was full of courage and genius, reminiscent of his years of victories. But time was his enemy, and the rains became his enemy, not his ally. The fields at Waterloo were so wet that Napoleon's cannons were stuck in the mud. And finally, the morning of June 18th, 1815 arrived. Close your eyes and imagine the moment. Under the gray clouds, two great armies faced each other. Napoleon's great army on the one hand, and the combined forces of British and Prussian soldiers on the other. The first attack was as effective as Napoleon had planned. French cavalry and infantry fearlessly attacked the ranks of Wellington's army. Fortunately, Napoleon was still a brilliant strategist and a leader who could encourage his troops. But unfortunately, the enemy he faced was no ordinary opponent. Wellington led his troops skillfully and was determined to protect his troops. On November 27th, Napoleon was assassinated by Marshal de Lacoste. As the day wore on, the fields of Waterloo were watered with blood. Napoleon had a brief sense of victory when the French captured the farm of La Haye-Sainte. But Blücher's Prussian forces arrived on the scene midway through the battle. Napoleon knew that this unexpected help would boost British morale and destabilize the French army. Before dark, Napoleon sent one of his strongest units, the Imperial Guard, to break through Wellington's line. Shouting, "The Imperial Guard will never retreat," the soldiers charged forward with one last hope. But this time, history was written differently. For the first time, the Guards retreated in the face of British resistance. The French army was now unraveling. When the war ended, it was also the end of an era for Napoleon. Waterloo was the end not only of a war, but of an empire. Napoleon had lost not only his army that day, but also his dreams. France surrendered, and Napoleon was sent to Saint Helena Island, this time in a much more distant exile. He would spend the rest of his life in the middle of the ocean, far away from the dizzying throne games of Europe. But was Waterloo really Napoleon's last battle? Or would his legacy and ideas continue to influence the world? How would you like to discover the answer to this question and the post-Napoleonic changes in Europe together? Section 6. My friends, life sometimes throws even the greatest heroes to a distant, lonely corner. Napoleon Bonaparte, once a leader who held Europe in the palm of his hand and brought kings to their knees, was now exiled to an almost forgotten corner of the world, the island of Saint Helena. This island was a rocky prison in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, where wild winds raged, where an emperor to spend his last days. In the fall of 1815, Napoleon was sent to Saint Helena, knowing that he would never again set foot on the glorious soil of France. This island was far away from Europe, both geographically and spiritually. He had left behind the energetic streets, squares, and battlefields of France. Now there was only the constant roar of the waves and the cold gray sky. In his first days on the island, he still tried to maintain a resilient and upright posture. But over time, loneliness, disappointment, and the ghosts of the past began to consume him. Napoleon was placed in a decaying house in Saint Helena called Longwood House. It was a monument of irony for an emperor whose former glory was gone. At night, as the wind howled through the walls, Napoleon longed for the sound of his once victorious armies. During the day, he seemed to relive his old battles and loved to play on maps. He set about writing his memoirs because he wanted to be not just a figure in history, but a narrator, writing his own story. Over the years, even his enemies had admired his intelligence, and now that intelligence was taking stock of the past and leaving a message beyond time. But Saint Helena was not only a physical exile, it was also a mental and spiritual exile. Napoleon would spend long hours in this distant land, thinking about how Europe would remember him. He weighed up past victories, defeats, and mistakes. For him, Waterloo was not just the loss of a battle, but the closing of an era. Saint Helena became the place where this era was mourned. Napoleon died in May 1821 at the age of 51. What caused his death was debated for many years: natural causes or slow poisoning. But beyond that, the real question was this: did Napoleon really die? His physical body was gone, yes, but his legacy, his ideas, and his influence would live on for much longer. Laws, systems of governance, and the modern conception of the state would bear traces of his era. Yes, my friends, Napoleon Bonaparte was a man with his faults, triumphs, and dreams. But he was also an idea, an era, and a legend. His life story may seem to end here, but his mark on world history is still fresh. But what kind of world would Napoleon's legacy inspire in the centuries to come? How would his legacy shape the foundations of the modern world?